The word ruthless is going to make some people uncomfortable. It is going to feel like a departure from the tone of compassion and understanding that has characterized everything explored in this series. It is going to feel, to the part of you that genuinely loves this person and genuinely understands the fear underneath the behavior, like a betrayal of the nuance, like a reduction of something complicated into something harder and less generous than it deserves. That discomfort is worth sitting with rather than resolving immediately, because the discomfort itself is information. The fact that the word ruthless feels wrong in this context, the fact that it produces a reflexive softening impulse, a desire to immediately qualify it back into something more palatable, that reflex is part of what this conversation is about, the reflex toward softening, toward the generous interpretation, toward the management of your own responses in deference to someone else's complexity. That reflex has been costing you, and this conversation is about what it looks like to be done with the cost. Ruthless, as it is being used here, does not mean cruel. It does not mean the cold, punishing withdrawal of someone who has converted their hurt into hardness. It does not mean the performance of indifference, or the strategic deployment of distance, or any of the calculated moves that are sometimes recommended as ways to handle avoidant behavior. It means something more specific and more internal than any of that. It means the complete, uncomplicating, unnegotiable application of your own standard to what you are experiencing, without the softening, without the framework providing the most generous interpretation, without the compassion for their limitation, overriding the honest assessment of what the limitation is producing in your life, without the understanding of why they do what they do being used one more time as the reason to absorb what they do. Ruthless means the refusal to negotiate with your own knowing, the refusal to override your own perception one more time in service of the hope, the refusal to translate the behavior into something more hopeful than the behavior actually supports, the refusal, clear and complete and not requiring anyone else's agreement, to continue absorbing a cost that was never yours to absorb. That refusal is not cruelty, it is the most honest thing available. Here is where the ruthlessness is most necessary, not in the grand gestures, not in the dramatic moments of confrontation or departure, in the small, ordinary daily moments where the softening reflex activates and you feel the familiar pull toward the generous interpretation. The moment they reach after a silence, and something in you immediately begins constructing the explanation for the silence. The moment they say something that lands as insufficient, and you feel the impulse to find the way it was actually more than it appeared. The moment the behavior produces hurt, and you notice yourself moving, almost automatically, toward the understanding of why, rather than the honest acknowledgement of what. Those moments are where the ruthlessness is required. Not the dramatic ruthlessness of a final speech or a permanent departure. The quiet, daily, unglamorous ruthlessness of someone who has decided to let the evidence be what it is. To let the behavior mean what it means. To let the hurt be hurt, rather than immediately converting it into the product of their understandable limitation. That conversion, hurt into understandable limitation, has been one of the most consistent features of how you have moved through this. It is not a flaw. It is the expression of genuine empathy and genuine intelligence, applied to someone whose behavior genuinely has psychological roots worth understanding. But it has a cost. Every conversion is a small override of your own experience. A small message to yourself that what you feel is less important than what they meant. That the impact is less significant than the intention. That your experience of the dynamic is subordinate to your understanding of its mechanism. Ruthlessness reverses that hierarchy. Your experience first, your knowing first, your honest assessment of what is happening and what it costs first. The framework second, the generous interpretation second, the understanding of why second. Not because the why is irrelevant, because the why has been functioning as a reason to dismiss the what. And the what, the actual, experienced, bodily registered reality of what the dynamic produces in your life, deserves to be primary. The ruthlessness has a specific application to the hope, because the hope is where the softening is most deeply entrenched. The hope is where the framework does its most significant work in service of the continuing. Where the understanding of hidden depth and suppressed love and the wall that exists because the feeling underneath is too large. Where all of that is most actively deployed in the service of the next extension of patience, the next interpretation of ambiguity as potential. The next conversion of insufficient behavior into evidence of a great love finding its difficult way toward expression. Being ruthless with the hope does not mean destroying it. It means examining it with the same honest, evidence-based attention that you would apply to anything else. Asking what the hope is based on. not what it is reaching for, what it is actually grounded in, what the evidence as opposed to the possibility actually supports. Evidence is behavior over time. Evidence is what happens in the ordinary moments when nothing particular is prompting effort. Evidence is the showing up and the repair and the movement toward you in the aggregate of the choices, rather than the exception of the best moments. Evidence is the pattern, not the outlier. The average, not the peak. When the hope is examined against the evidence, rather than against the possibility, it either holds or it does not. If it holds, if the evidence genuinely supports the conclusion that movement is occurring, that change is real, that the behavior in aggregate describes someone who is actually trying, then the hope is not hope in the problematic sense. It is the reasonable expectation of someone watching a real process unfold. If it does not hold, if the evidence examined honestly describes the stable pattern rather than genuine movement, the consistent management rather than real change, the convenient engagement rather than actual investment, then the hope is not serving you. It is substituting for the more painful, more directly actionable truth that the evidence is pointing toward. Ruthlessness means letting the evidence determine the hope, rather than letting the hope determine the reading of the evidence. There is a version of this conversation that soft pedals here, that says yes, be honest, but also hold space for complexity, also maintain compassion, also remember that the ruthlessness should not harden you. And all of that is true in its own way. Complexity is real. Compassion is genuine. Hardening is its own problem. But the soft pedaling has been the default for long enough. The compassion has been the default for long enough. The holding of space for their complexity has been the default for long enough. And the default has produced a specific, identifiable, honestly accessible result. It has produced the continuing of the dynamic, the extending of the patience, the absorbing of the cost, the maintaining of the orientation toward their process, while your own life waited in the background for the primary attention it deserved. The ruthlessness is the corrective, not the permanent replacement of compassion with hardness, the temporary, necessary, genuinely overdue application of the standard that the softening has been consistently preventing from being applied. Your standard, the one that says what you need to feel genuinely cared for, is not excessive, that the minimum of someone who is actually invested is not asking too much, that the behavior examined honestly either meets that minimum or it does not, that the not meeting is not a reason to lower the minimum. It is information about the fit between what this dynamic offers and what you actually require. That information, received without the softening reflex converting it into something more manageable, is what the ruthlessness produces. Not comfort, clarity. The specific, complete, action-enabling clarity of someone who has finally, completely allowed the evidence to mean what it means. What does being ruthless actually change? In the practical, daily, lived sense, what is different when the ruthlessness is genuinely operating rather than theoretically endorsed? The analysis stops. The continuous circular framework deploying analysis of what they meant and what they felt and what the behavior might be concealing, and whether the silence indicates loading grief or simple indifference. That stops. Not because the questions are uninteresting, because the answers, however accurate, have been serving the hoping rather than the clarity. The ruthlessness removes the motivation for the analysis, because it removes the framework that made the analysis feel productive. There is nothing to analyze your way toward. The evidence is what it is. The behavior means what it means. The analysis was always, in part, the hope finding something to do with itself. The justifying stops. The internal monologue that explains their behavior in terms that make the continuing feel reasonable, that stops. Not through suppression, through the honest application of the standard that says the explanation does not change the impact. That the why, however accurate, does not transform the what into something you are willing to continue receiving. The justifying required the belief that understanding the mechanism was the same as accepting the outcome. Ruthlessness decouples those. You can understand completely and still refuse to absorb. The waiting stops. The specific, life-suspending, genuine presence preventing waiting for the resolution of their internal process. That stops. Not because the resolution is impossible, because the waiting was costing your actual life, and the ruthlessness is the honest acknowledgement that the cost is not acceptable, regardless of what the resolution might eventually produce. And something else stops. Something quieter and more important than any of the above. The internal negotiation stops. The internal negotiation is the continuous, below the level of conscious awareness process of talking yourself out of your own knowing, of taking the clear signal that something is not right and running it through the framework until it comes out the other side as something more manageable, of hearing what your own experience is telling you and finding the interpretation that makes acting on it unnecessary. That negotiation is exhausting. It requires more energy than the external work of navigating the dynamic, because it is the work of being two people simultaneously, the one who knows and the one who is managing the knowing, the one who sees clearly and the one who is applying the generous interpretation to what is seen, the one who is hurt and the one who is converting the hurt into understanding. Ruthlessness is the ending of the negotiation, not through the suppression of one side of it, through the decision that the knowing is the final word, that the clear signal is sufficient, that the experience of the impact is not subordinate to the understanding of the mechanism, that your experience, your honest assessment of what this is and what it costs, that is the primary authority, not the framework, not the hope, not the love that makes the generous interpretation feel like the only acceptable one. Your knowing, primary, that is the ruthlessness. And it is, in the end, not a departure from compassion. It is the first genuinely compassionate thing you have done for yourself in a very long time. The ruthlessness that ended the last section, the internal, non-negotiable application of your own standard, that is worth grounding in something practical. Because ruthlessness as a concept is easier to endorse than to actually live in the specific moments where the softening reflex fires, and the generous interpretation is immediately available, and the love makes the honest assessment feel like a betrayal of something real. So let's talk about what it actually looks like. Not as inspiration, as instruction. The first practical application of ruthlessness is the ending of the interpretive project as the primary response to confusing behavior. When something they do lands strangely, when the behavior is ambiguous, when the signal is mixed, when the silence has a quality that could mean several things, the ruthless response is not to reach for the framework, not to ask what attachment mechanism might explain this, not to find the reading that preserves the narrative of hidden depth. The ruthless response is to ask a simpler question: how does this feel? Not what does it mean, how does it feel? In the body, before the mind gets involved, before the framework provides its most generous interpretation and the hope finds the reading that allows the continuing. The body knows before the mind does. The body registers the impact of the behavior before the mind has had time to explain it. And the body's registration, the specific pre-verbal, honest quality of how something lands in the chest or the stomach, or the particular tension that appears in the shoulders, when something is not right, that registration is more reliable than any interpretation the mind subsequently produces. Ruthlessness means trusting the body's first response, not as the final word on everything, but as the primary data, the thing the interpretation has to account for rather than explain away. The second practical application is the ending of the performance of being fine with things you are not fine with. This one is subtle enough that it often operates below the level of conscious awareness. It is the accommodation that happens so automatically it does not feel like a choice, the accepting of the insufficient explanation, the receiving of the partial presence as though it were the full thing, the responding to the managed warmth as though it were the genuine article. The performance of being satisfied by what you are being given when the honest, unperformed truth is that what you are being given is not enough. That performance has a function in the dynamic. It reduces friction. It maintains the temperature at a level the avoidance system can tolerate. It prevents the conversation that might produce the distance that the hope cannot afford. It keeps the connection intact at the cost of your honest experience of it. Ruthlessness is the ending of the performance, not through the dramatic declaration of everything that has been suppressed, through the quiet, consistent, non-negotiable refusal to perform satisfaction with what is not satisfying, to express warmth you do not feel, to accept explanations that do not account for the actual experience, to receive partial presence as though it were the full thing when your honest experience is that the partiality is the thing, the consistent, defining, pattern-level thing. The ending of the performance does not require confrontation. It requires honesty, the specific, quiet, internally grounded honesty of someone who has stopped managing their own responses in deference to someone else's comfort. Who lets what is not enough be not enough? Who lets what hurts be something that hurt? Who stops converting their honest experience into something more manageable before it can be expressed or even fully felt? The third practical application is the one that requires the most and produces the most. It is the application of ruthlessness to the question of your time, specifically, concretely. in the honest accounting of where the hours are going and what they are being given to, and whether the giving is producing anything proportionate to the cost. Time is the most honest currency available, because time, unlike emotional energy or attention or caring, is finite in a way that is not abstract. You have a specific, limited, irreplaceable amount of it. And every hour given to the analysis and the hoping and the waiting and the management of your own responses in deference to the dynamics requirements, every hour given to those things is an hour that belonged to your actual life and was spent elsewhere. The ruthless accounting of time is not a guilt exercise. It is a clarity exercise. The question is not whether the time was wasted. That framing is too punitive and too simple. The question is whether the time, going forward, is being consciously allocated or unconsciously consumed. Whether you are choosing where the hours go, or whether the dynamic is choosing for you. Whether the morning that starts with the involuntary monitoring of where things stand is a morning you chose to give to that, or a morning that was taken by the habit of it. Ruthlessness about time means the conscious, daily, non-negotiable reclamation of the hours from the monitoring, from the analysis, from the hoping in its various sophisticated forms. Not through suppression, through the genuine, grounded, increasingly automatic redirection of attention toward the actual content of your actual life. The work, the people, the questions, the building, the things that are yours and that deserve the quality of attention that the dynamic has been consuming. Now something needs to be said about what ruthlessness is not, because the word carries associations that are worth addressing directly, rather than leaving to produce their own distortions. Ruthlessness is not the decision that the person you loved is without value, or without genuine complexity, or without the real psychological depth that the framework describes. It is not the conversion of compassion into contempt. It is not the hardening of your perception of them into the flattest, least generous version available, because that version makes the leaving easier. The leaving, if leaving is what the ruthlessness produces, does not require the diminishment of who they are. You can see someone clearly and fully, can understand the fear and the limitation and the genuine psychological roots of the behavior, can hold the real complexity of a person whose capacity was insufficient for what you needed without that insufficiency making them a simpler or lesser person than they are. And still leave, still apply the standard, still refuse to absorb the cost, still redirect the time and the energy and the caring toward things and people that can meet them adequately. The ruthlessness is not about them. It is about you, about the non-negotiable application of your own standard to your own life, about the refusal to continue subordinating your honest experience to the project of understanding someone else's, about the reclamation of the primary authority over your own interior that the dynamic has been, in various ways, occupying. There is a specific moment that the ruthlessness is building toward, not a confrontation, not a declaration, a moment that is entirely internal and entirely sufficient without any external expression at all. The moment you stop arguing with yourself about it. Because that is what the negotiation has been, an argument. Continuous, exhausting, consuming enormous amounts of cognitive and emotional energy, one side presenting the evidence clearly, the other side deploying the framework in the service of the more hopeful interpretation. Back and forth. The evidence and the hope. The honest assessment and the generous reading. The knowing and the managing of the knowing. The ruthlessness ends the argument, not by defeating one side, by withdrawing the energy that the argument requires to continue. By deciding that the knowing is sufficient, that the evidence has been examined enough, that the framework has provided everything useful it is going to provide, and is now functioning primarily as the continuation of the negotiation. When the argument ends, when the knowing is simply allowed to be the knowing without the immediate deployment of the counter-interpretation, something quiets, not the feeling. The feeling remains. The love remains. The grief remains. The complicated, real, not entirely resolved quality of caring about someone whose behavior has been consistently, honestly, finally accepted as insufficient. All of that remains. What quiets is the noise, the circular, consuming, life-suspending noise of the argument with your own knowing. And in the quiet, in the specific, unfamiliar, initially almost suspicious quiet of no longer arguing with yourself, something becomes audible that the noise was always covering. Your own life, making its ordinary demands, proceeding without fanfare, containing in its actual present unheroic texture more than the argument was allowing you to notice. The work that matters, the people who are actually there, the questions that are genuinely yours, the directions that were always available and were receiving insufficient attention because the argument was consuming so much of the foreground. The ruthlessness was never really about them. It was always about this, the reclamation of the foreground, the return of your own life to the primary position it deserved and lost at some point during the hoping. Not through drama, not through the grand gesture of departure or the finally said everything speech. Through the quiet, daily, utterly unglamorous decision to stop arguing with what you already know, to let the knowing be enough, to let the life that is waiting in the quiet of the ended argument be the thing you turn toward, fully, without the negotiation pulling you back, without one more generous interpretation standing between you and the honest, simple, completely sufficient truth. You know what this is. You have always known. The ruthlessness is just the decision to finally believing yourself. That is where the last section ended, and it is the right place to end, not as a dramatic conclusion, but as the most practical, most daily, most genuinely actionable thing available. But before this conversation closes, something honest needs to be said, something that the momentum of the series, the accumulated weight of all the frameworks, and the psychological depth, and the careful, compassionate excavation of avoidant behavior may have been quietly obscuring. Not everything in this series applies to your situation. Some of it does. Probably a significant portion of it resonated in the specific recognition-producing way that accurate things resonate. But some of it may have provided a framework that your situation does not actually require. A level of psychological complexity applied to something that is, in its actual form, more straightforward. This matters because frameworks, however accurate in their domain, can become their own form of staying inside the question, rather than acting on the answer. The more sophisticated the understanding, the more there is to understand. The more there is to understand, the longer the understanding can substitute for the simpler, more directly actionable truth. The simpler truth is this: some relationships do not work, not because of attachment theory, not because of nervous system wiring or early childhood adaptation, or the sophisticated mechanisms of deactivating strategies, simply because the two people involved are not building something that is good for both of them. Because the investment is unequal, or the care is insufficient, or the basic observable behaviorally evidenced reality of how one person treats another does not meet the minimum standard of genuine respect. When that is the situation, the most useful thing is not a deeper framework. It is the honest acknowledgement of what the situation is, followed by the practical, unglamorous, life-returning work of actually leaving it behind. Leaving it behind does not require the complete resolution of every psychological question the relationship raised. It does not require the full understanding of their attachment style, or the complete excavation of your own patterns, or the perfect integration of every insight this series has offered before you are permitted to move forward. It requires one thing: the decision that your life, the actual, present, finite, genuinely worth inhabiting life that is yours, is more important than the continued engagement with the question of someone who has consistently shown you, through behavior rather than through hidden depth, what they are capable of offering. That decision does not have to be dramatic, does not have to be announced, does not have to be made once and held perfectly without the old pulls reasserting. It can be made quietly, remade daily if necessary, held imperfectly, dropped and returned to. What matters is the direction, that the general, overall, when you step back and look at the aggregate direction of your life, is moving toward your own ground rather than continuing to orbit around someone else's limitation. The psychological understanding this series offered is genuinely valuable. Understanding why people do what they do reduces unnecessary self-blame. It prevents the misattribution of someone else's limitation as evidence of your inadequacy. It supports the kind of honest, compassionate grief that allows the loss to be fully felt and therefore genuinely processed, rather than endlessly recycled. But the understanding was always meant to be in service of that, in service of the grief and the clarity and the return to your own life. It was not meant to be the destination, not meant to be the thing you live inside indefinitely, adding layer upon layer of psychological context to a situation whose most honest message has been available for some time. The message is not hidden. It is not encoded in the mechanisms of avoidant attachment requiring sophisticated decryption. It is in the behavior, plainly, over time, in the ordinary moments. You have read the message, you have understood it with more depth and more compassion and more psychological nuance than most people bring to their own experience. Now the only remaining question is whether you are going to act on it. Acting on it looks different for different people in different situations. For some, it means the complete, clean ending of contact. For some, it means the honest renegotiation of what the connection can be, stripped of the hope that it will become something the evidence does not support. For some, it means simply the internal shift already described throughout this series, the genuine reorientation towards your own life that makes the external situation less relevant because you are no longer primarily organized around it. Whatever form it takes, the acting on it shares a common feature. It is honest, it is based on the evidence rather than the hope. It does not require the other person's agreement or understanding or validation to be the right thing. It does not wait for the perfect moment or the complete resolution of every complicated feeling or the arrival of certainty that does not come before action, but after it. It simply moves in the direction that the honest reading of the evidence has been pointing, with the imperfect, uncertain, genuinely human quality of someone who does not have everything resolved, but has decided that the direction is clear enough. You have been in this conversation for a long time, not just this video, this series. The accumulated weight of everything explored here represents a genuine, sustained engagement with something that mattered enough to examine this carefully. That examination was worthwhile. The understanding it produced is real. The self-knowledge it generated will serve you in ways that extend far beyond this particular relationship or this particular dynamic. But the examination is complete. There is not a deeper layer of framework that will finally produce the clarity the hoping can rest in. There is not a more sophisticated understanding of avoidant psychology that will resolve the question the situation has been posing. The question has been answered by the evidence, by the behavior over time, by the honest, unmanaged reading of what was actually shown rather than what was hoped to be hidden underneath. The answer is what it is. You know what it is. The ruthlessness is believing it. The life is what comes after, ordinary, genuinely yours, not waiting for anyone's resolution or transformation or finally expressed depth. Just here, just now. Just the real, present, completely sufficient fact of your own existence, moving forward. That is enough. It was always enough, and it is, finally, where you are. There is a specific kind of strength that develops in a person who has been through what you have been through. Not the strength that is performed, not the armored nothing touches me version that people sometimes mistake for healing, the quieter, more durable kind. The kind that comes from having stayed present through something genuinely difficult, from having felt the full weight of it rather than managing it at a comfortable distance, from having been willing, repeatedly and at real cost, to look honestly at something that resisted honest looking. That strength is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It shows up in small ways. In the moment you notice the old pull and feel it without following it. In the morning that belongs to you. In the conversation where you say what you actually think without the prior calculation of how it will land. In the quality of your own company, which has become slowly and without ceremony genuinely good. The ruthlessness this conversation has been describing is not separate from that strength. It is an expression of it. The natural earned, genuinely grounded capacity of someone who has examined something thoroughly enough that the examination is complete. Who has extended compassion long enough and generously enough that the extending has run its full course. Who has understood deeply enough that the understanding is no longer producing new information, only the continuation of the familiar loop. The loop ends not with a conclusion, but with a redirection. The attention that was going around the loop finds something else to do with itself, not through discipline or willpower, through the simple structural reality of a life that has enough genuine content to absorb the attention that the loop was consuming. That is what the ruthlessness produces. Not the dramatic ending, the quiet, daily, increasingly natural experience of the attention being elsewhere. Genuinely elsewhere. Occupied by things that are actually happening in the life that is actually yours. Let's talk about what comes after. Not abstractly, in the specific, ordinary, unglamorous texture of days that are being lived rather than suspended. What comes after is the rediscovery of your own appetite. Not the managed, edited, calibrated version of wanting that developed inside the dynamic. The version that learned to want less, ask for less, need less in order to maintain a connection that required your smallness to function. The actual appetite, the genuine, unedited, naturally sized wanting that was present before the dynamic trained it into a more acceptable form. That appetite returns slowly. It does not announce itself. It surfaces in small moments that can seem unrelated to anything significant. The afternoon you find yourself genuinely absorbed in something, without the background monitoring running. The conversation where you are fully present because there is nothing elsewhere demanding the portion of your attention that the hoping used to consume. The moment you realize you have an opinion about something, a clear, unhesitating, entirely yours opinion, without the prior assessment of how it will be received. Those moments are the appetite returning, the genuine, unmanaged, yours alone wanting, reasserting itself in the space that the dynamics requirements used to occupy. The returning appetite has a specific quality that is worth recognizing when it arrives. It is not urgent. That is the first thing. After the particular urgency of the avoidant dynamic, the low-grade, continuous, hope-sustaining urgency of someone who is always slightly unsure of where they stand, the returning appetite feels almost leisurely by comparison. It does not press, it does not have the anxious reach toward it quality of wanting that was always accompanied by the question of whether the wanting would be met. It simply wants, without the anxiety attached to the wanting. Without the prior calculation of whether the wanting is too much or appropriately sized or likely to be received in a way that maintains the connection rather than threatening it. That quality, wanting without the anxiety of the wanting, is one of the more specific and less discussed aspects of genuine recovery from this kind of dynamic. Because the anxiety was so thoroughly attached to the wanting for so long that the two can become indistinguishable. The wanting starts to feel like it requires the anxiety as its companion. And when the anxiety begins to quiet, when the ground becomes stable enough that the wanting no longer triggers the monitoring of how it will be received, the wanting itself can feel unfamiliar. Almost too quiet, almost suspicious in its simplicity. It is not suspicious, it is healthy. It is the wanting functioning the way wanting functions when it is not inside a dynamic that required its continuous management. The relationships that come after, not necessarily romantic though eventually those two, have a different quality from the beginning. Not because you have become more guarded, because you have become more honest. The honesty is not a performance of directness or a new policy of stating your needs immediately, or any of the practices that get recommended as the antidote to the accommodating pattern. It is subtler than that. It is the honesty of someone who no longer has the same investment in the management of first impressions, who is not, from the first conversation, calculating the acceptable amount of themselves to bring, who does not arrive at new connections with the prior question of how much to reveal and when, and whether the revealing will produce the distance that was always the thing to be managed. They arrive as themselves, not all at once. Nobody arrives as their full self in the first conversation, but without the prior editing, without the self-reduction that was so thoroughly practiced inside the dynamic that it became the default mode of relational presentation. That absence of prior editing is felt by the people encountering you. They feel, without necessarily being able to name it, the quality of someone who is genuinely present rather than present in the managed form, who is actually there rather than there in the version that was calibrated to be acceptable. And that quality of genuine, unmanaged, simply real presence is one of the most compelling things one person can offer another. Not to the avoidant necessarily. The avoidant system, as has been thoroughly established, is precisely activated by genuine presence in certain forms. But to people whose attachment systems are not organized around the management of closeness, to people who are actually available for the quality of connection that genuine presence makes possible, those people have been around. They were around during the dynamic, receiving the managed version of you and finding it good, but perhaps sensing the management, sensing the portion of you that was elsewhere. The attention that was partially consumed by the monitoring, the warmth that was genuine but also slightly divided. They will receive the undivided version differently, with a quality of recognition that has its own particular texture. The recognition of someone encountering the real thing. Not the presented version, not the calibrated version. The actual person with their actual appetite and their actual opinions and their actual, unmanaged, genuinely and completely theirs presence. That recognition, experienced from the other side, the experience of being genuinely seen rather than received, is one of the things that makes the distinction between the old dynamic and what comes after so palpable. Not as a concept, as a felt experience. The difference between being with someone who is managing you and being with someone who is actually there. The work that remains, and there is always work remaining, because growth does not conclude at any particular point, is the maintenance of the honest assessment. The ongoing, daily, non-dramatic application of the ruthlessness to new situations as they arise. Not as a suspicious monitoring of every new connection for the signs of the old pattern, as the natural, background, increasingly automatic discernment of someone who has learned through experience what genuine investment looks like and what managed distance feels like, and how early the difference is perceptible if you are paying attention with honest eyes rather than hopeful ones. The difference is perceptible early, earlier than the hoping always wanted to believe. The signals are present in the first conversations, if the attention is genuinely on the signals rather than on the construction of the most hopeful interpretation. The quality of genuine curiosity versus performed interest. The presence of actual repair when something goes wrong versus the management of the conversation back to more comfortable territory. The willingness to be inconvenienced by your needs versus the subtle, consistent repositioning of your needs as the thing requiring management. Those signals are readable. Your instrument is calibrated for them now in a way it was not before. Not because you became cynical, because you became honest. Because the experience of the dynamic, lived through with genuine attention and genuine willingness to examine what was actually happening, sharpened the perception in specific and useful ways. Use the sharpened perception not as a weapon against the possibility of connection, as the tool it is, the tool that allows you to distinguish between what is genuinely available and what is performing availability. Between warmth that is consistent and warmth that is rationed. Between someone who is actually building something with you and someone who is managing a connection at the temperature their comfort requires. Those distinctions, made early and made honestly, protect not through the prevention of connection, but through the direction of investment toward situations that can actually return it. Toward people whose capacity genuinely matches the depth you bring. Whose own ground is solid enough that your presence is not a threat requiring management, but an encounter with something they have their own equivalent of. That matching of depth with depth, of genuine investment with genuine investment, of real presence with real presence, is the experience that the dynamic was always pretending to offer and could never quite deliver. Not because the love was false. Because the capacity was mismatched. And capacity, as has been established, is the variable that determines whether love can build into something rather than continuously cycling through the same managed temperature. You have capacity, significant capacity, the kind that was on display throughout the entire arc of the dynamic, in the patience and the understanding and the sustained, generous, freely given presence that you extended over a real period of time. That capacity is not the problem. It was never the problem. The problem was the direction it was pointed, the mismatch between what you brought and what the situation could hold. Pointed at a matched capacity, at someone who brings their own equivalent depth and their own genuine investment and their own solid enough ground that the connection can build rather than cycle, your capacity produces something extraordinary. Not the extraordinary of the difficult, charged, almost connection that the avoidant dynamic generates. The quieter, more durable, more genuinely sustaining extraordinary of two people who are actually building something, together, with equivalent investment. On ground that holds for both of them, that extraordinary is available. It is not the fantasy of someone who has not encountered enough of real life to know better. It is the reasonable expectation of someone who has enough self-knowledge to bring their genuine self to a connection, and enough discernment to recognize when the connection is meeting that genuine self, rather than managing it. The avoidant dynamic taught you something that no easier experience could have taught in the same depth or with the same permanent specificity. It taught you the difference between love that builds and love that cycles. Between presence that is genuine and presence that is managed. Between investment that is real and investment that is convenient. Between someone who is choosing you and someone who is keeping you at the distance their comfort requires. You know those differences now, not as concepts. In the body, in the specific felt pre-verbal quality of how situations register before the mind has had time to deploy the framework. That knowing is the inheritance. Not the only inheritance, the ground, the self-trust, the ruthlessness, the rediscovered appetite, the genuine okayness. All of that is the inheritance. But the knowing is the most practically useful, the most immediately applicable to the next situation and the one after that. The instrument that was sharpened by the experience of navigating something that resisted easy navigation. And the next situation, whenever it arrives, in whatever form, will be navigated differently. Not perfectly, not without the occasional activation of the old patterns or the familiar pull of the old dynamic's particular electricity. Those things do not disappear completely. They become less compelling, less able to override the discernment, less capable of producing the full, life-suspending investment that the dynamic required and received. because the ground is different now. The self-knowledge is different. The willingness to let the evidence be primary rather than the hope, that is different. And different ground produces different navigation, different choices, different outcomes. Not the forced different of someone who has decided through willpower to be different. The natural, structural, gradually becomes the default different of someone who has genuinely changed the internal landscape that the choices emerge from. That is the real inheritance of everything covered in this series, not the understanding of avoidant psychology, the change in the internal landscape, the ground, the ruthlessness, the okayness. The genuine, inhabited, no longer waiting life. From that landscape, everything that comes next emerges differently. Not because of the avoidant, not because of the dynamic or its cost, or the reckoning it eventually produced, or the clarity that arrived through the grief. Because of what you did with all of it. Because of the choice, made quietly, remade daily, held imperfectly but held, to use the experience for the building rather than the cycling, for the growth rather than the continuation. For the genuine, honest, evidence-based movement toward a life that is actually yours, and actually good, and actually in its ordinary, unglamorous, completely sufficient reality worth showing up for. Fully. Without management. Without the prior editing. Without anyone's permission or validation, or finally expressed depth required to make it real. Just you, here, alive in your own life. That was always the destination. You are already there.